Thank you all for having me. I appreciate everybody here in person. Also, all of you online from all parts over the world. Thank you for being here. It is an honor to be back. I always joke that because I travel, speaking and teaching for a living, so I always joke that I can judge a city based upon the weather that they provide to me when I visit. So I showed up last night to the cold and rain, but I appreciate Minneapolis hosting me a second time. Mark's right. I was here about a year and a half ago for a web performance workshop. So I'm well familiar with this space. I'm glad to be back. Mark runs a fantastic workshop series. Like I said, I go all over the world and I hear just random people at a conference somewhere in a different part of the world talking about a video they saw from this. So you guys are incredibly lucky to be part of that. I encourage you to continue to do so, continue to spread the word. I'm very pleased to be also helping with that. As a slight side note on that web performance workshop, I'm slightly embarrassed by it, although I think there's lots of great content, but that actually happened to be the very first workshop that I ever taught, long form workshop. I had done plenty of speaking before, but Mark kind of gave me my start in teaching, and I didn't even really know at the time. He kind of contacted me out of the blue and said, "I've seen you speak, what would you think about teaching?" I had kind of a bent towards teaching, but I'd never really done it in this industry. And so I was excited to kind of try it out and see, and I was insanely nervous the night before, not knowing if I had too much content or not enough content. I had no idea really what I was doing, but he gave me a shot, kind of an unknown in terms of speaking and teaching. And that actually, I didn't know at the time, but that launched the career that I now have. So I now do this full time, and I appreciate Mark for giving me my start. So it's good to be back here. So I'm Kyle Simpson, known as Getify online. If you're into that online stalking thing, you can check out all kinds of links to where to find me and provide feedback, whether that be questions, whether it be telling me that I said something that you completely disagree with. That's totally okay. But Getify.me has links to all kinds of things about me. As I mentioned before, what I spend my time full-time doing, and I say full-time kind of with some air quotes because I don't actually work full-time at it, but it is the only thing that I do that I pay my bills with. So I call it my full-time job, and that's teaching. And that involves corporate teaching. So a number of big companies that I travel all over to do teaching for, the Intels and things like that. I also do public workshops at a lot of places when I go and do when I'm in some city for a conference. I just did a public workshop a few weeks ago while in London. And so I know some of you that are online were part of that process as well. So welcome to you there in London. So I teach for a living now, and just as a little plug for that, if anything that I say is interesting, if you find this stuff interesting and useful, I encourage you to go back and talk with your companies, talk with your meetup groups, things like that, anybody, and if I'm available for hire, so I can travel anywhere to teach. So I'd love to do that if that would be helpful to you or your company or your group. The other part of my time that I spend, so I spend about maybe 50 to 75% of my time doing that, but the other part of my time I spend on what I call community building, and this involves a variety of open source activities, open source development, writing on the books, which we'll get to in just a moment, speaking at conferences, running meetups and things like that. And so my goal is to sort of, it's an all boats rise with the tide. My goal is to build awareness about the web platform and about its technologies so that more people are aware of it, more people appreciate it. And by the way, the word appreciate doesn't necessarily mean like. It just means to respect, to understand, to realize the usefulness of. So my goal, I'm an independent, but I'm sort of an open web evangelist. And my goal is to go everywhere and try to evangelize what the open web platform can do and try to help people learn that better. And I feel like the more people that appreciate that technology, the more opportunities that'll give me to teach. So to that end, some of the time that I spend, I do quite a bit of open source development on a whole variety of things. If you check out my GitHub, just mention a couple of real quick projects that I work on. So Lab.js is the one I'm probably most known for. Lab.js is a dynamic script loader. It's coming up on 5 years old now, so it's actually getting to be rather ancient in terms of open source technology. But it is probably its most important feature is that it is its stability, because it's almost 3 years since the last time it had to be changed. Now, I know many of you know about open source projects that every couple of weeks they're releasing another patch and adding a new feature and things like that. But I consider stability to be its most important feature because it has been battle tested, it's been hardened, it does exactly what it's supposed to do, no more, no less, and it continues. Now, I maintain the project in terms of, if there are bugs or things like that. I get people posting issues from time to time, and we track them down, and it turns out, it's not actually a bug. But if there was one, we would certainly do that. It's been in use by big companies like the Zapposes and Twitters and Vimeos of the world, so you can trust that it has been put to the ringer. It's just a really low-level, simple script loader. It's not at a higher level in terms of dependency management, things like require, that have lots of complicated configuration. It's nothing of that nature. It's just load some scripts and get them done as fast as possible, ensure the execution order so dependencies are met. Now, why would I even bring up a script loader these days? Because A, we have these dependency managers, and that's what everybody in the world seems to be using. And B, we all know that, the simplest and easiest way to get all your scripts loaded is to just concatenate everything in a build process, right? So why would I even talk about a script loader? Why would lab.js even matter? I have a prediction. I don't know if it'll be true, but I have a prediction that we're going to see a renaissance in script loader technology. It's kind of fallen by the wayside. It doesn't get a lot of attention these days, but we're seeing a switch in our platform technology, and that is the advent of HTTP 2.0 or HTTP 2. And that's not quite like IPv6, where people have been talking about it for a decade, and yeah, maybe someday we'll actually get IPv6. HTTP 2 is a reality. It's already happened in all of the browsers that you're using, probably already supporting it. A number of the big web services out on the web, they're already serving up over HTTP 2 if your browser is capable of it in the right circumstances. And why would I bring that up? What's the big difference about it? Well, it turns out that with HTTP 2, everything that we learned about optimizing our web page load performance to reduce the number of files, combining everything, combining all our JavaScript into one file, all our CSS, all our images into sprites, everything that we learned there, turns out that's the worst possible thing that you can do in HTTP 2. Because the HTTP 2 protocol is a persistent socket protocol, much like WebSockets. It establishes one handshake, and then it interleaves bits and bytes, and interleaves the files and downloads everything in parallel. So if you have one giant file, it can't really do that. And you want to have as many small chunks and small files as you have. So we've all spent the better part of the last 5 years building out hundreds of tiny little AMD files, and we've got these build processes that are putting them all into one big file and shipping that out to the browser. I predict over the next year or two, we're going to see people are going to still have hundreds of little files, and how are they going to load those things when they have to switch to loading them all as separate resources rather than as one? And I predict that we'll see a renaissance of script loading technology, of people trying to figure that out. And I also predict that lab.js will just be patiently waiting in the corner if anybody wants to check that out. So you can take a look at lab.js if you want to look at performance script loading. Grips is a templating engine that I wrote a couple of years ago. I've been kind of tinkering on it for a while. Now, it's not because there's not 1,000 other templating engines out there. There certainly are. But there are some problems that I've seen in sort of the front-end templating world. So I kind of group templating engines into two extremes. On one end of the spectrum, we have templating engines which are extremely what they call logicless, like extremely stripped down, as little logic or no logic as possible. Many of you are probably familiar with Mustache and variants thereof. They call themselves logicless templates, or sort of zero logic templates. And the idea behind that is we don't want to put business logic inside of our templates, so let's make a templating engine that has no logic. Ergo, we've solved our problem, because you can't put logic inside of the template. And the spirit of that is great. Obviously, I totally agree with the idea of keeping these, keeping the separation of concerns, keeping our business logic out of the templates. In practice, however, I've tried using those in production systems, and in practice, what I find is that there's an awful lot of tinkering with the data, of massaging it to just be just right inside of our controllers, because there's very little flexibility in the front end layer. So we have to massage the data to be just right. We sometimes have to pollute our data model with what we call presentational data. So if you want to loop over the months of the year to put in a dropdown, we have to stick that data alongside of your data model and ship that off into your template, because the expressiveness of the templating engine restricts you from doing that sort of thing. So unfortunately, while we were trying to create a separation of of concerns between our controller and our view, we ended up creating this really brittle tie between the two. And you have to really understand your view to write your controller, and you have to really understand your controller while you're writing your view, and vice versa. So the theory is great, but the practice somewhat lacks. And that's, you know, a common theme among a lot of things in the web technology world. On the other end of the spectrum, from logicless templates, we have this idea that says, well, I do need to do some logic, so why don't we just use a standard language that everybody knows? Let's just throw a whole programming language inside of the templating engine. As a base example of that, PHP is a templating engine with the PHP programming language embedded inside of it. Other examples that you may be more familiar with, Dust and handlebars and other things like that. You know, you have the full JavaScript language or the full Ruby language or something like that as your expressiveness inside of your templates. And I liken that to me handing you a pile of rope, and I can say, I can either teach you with this pile of rope to build a rope bridge, which is quite helpful, or I can teach you to build a noose, and that's not quite so helpful, at least in some circumstances. And the problem is that under the pressure that says your boss is breathing down your neck and says, hey, you've got 10 minutes to get this thing in there. We need, you know, some logic around this thing so that it hides under certain circumstances. When you have the ability to put an if statement inside of your templating engine, and your boss says, you got to get this done, and that's the expedient way to do it, we put an if statement there. And then maybe we make ourselves a comment that says, come back, you know, our famous to-do, fix this kind of comment, come back and fix this, which we know we're never actually going to come back and do, but, you know, the spirit of it is great. We want to fix it. And then 6 months later, it's not even you, it's somebody else on your team. The boss is breathing down their neck saying, hey, there's another condition now that needs to be wrapped. So then they go in and put in, you know, and some other condition, and they call out to some other controller method. And before long, you see that you've got business logic leaked into your templates. And the pressure behind the expediency says, just do what's quick, and then theoretically, you know, we'll come back. I have this book that I want to write someday called The Myth of the Refactor. We all like to think that we're going to refactor things in practice. You know, there's millions of lines of code being written every day, and most of those lines of code will never be seen again by another human being. And that's kind of a sobering fact to think about, but it's kind of a reality that we deal with. So there's this tension between no logic, too much logic, and where is the middle? It's kind of like the Goldilocks. Could there be somewhere in the middle that satisfies the needs but doesn't give us too much? And my experiment in that is the Grips templating engine. It's a restrained templating engine syntax that gives you the power to do what you should be doing, and it restricts you from doing the things that I think you shouldn't be doing, like making method calls and doing arithmetic and other sorts of business combinatorial logic. So you can check out that if that's at all interesting in terms of the pain points that you've looked at. One other little note about Grips is that another experiment that I'm working on right now is a CSS templating engine built on top of Grips. Now, many of you are familiar with CSS preprocessors like Less and Sass and things like that. And with CSS preprocessors, we get the ability to sort of preprocess our CSS files, you know, use variables and includes and other things like that. But it kind of it's like it got halfway and then it just sort of stopped in terms of the evolution of that technology. We got preprocessors, and then we just said, well, the only thing we need to innovate on is coming up with new inventive syntax to stuff inside of our style sheets. And I think we missed the boat, because I think CSS templating, which treats it as a separate process that you're compiling a template from when you're rendering it, and it externalizes your data. In the exact same way that we think about our HTML templates, we can think about our CSS as templates. So I'm experimenting with CSS templating. I think it's a lot more powerful than just CSS preprocessing, and I've built that as a module on top of Grips. So if any of that's interesting, you can check out Grips. And finally, I won't spend any time talking about this, because at the end of today we'll talk about this, but Asequence is a promises-like asynchronous flow control library that I wrote. It's really tiny, less than 2K, to give you the power to express sort of promises-like syntax for asynchronicity.